A former NASA astronaut has released a set of photographs he says were taken during a mission he was part of decades ago, and the images, if they are genuine, show something that the official lunar record has never officially acknowledged. Structures, not craters, not rock formations. Geometric shapes shadowed against the regolith, with lines that do not soften the way natural features soften in oblique sunlight. The astronaut, whose interview ran last month on an independent science podcast, described his decision to release the photos as one he had been considering for most of his life. He said he wanted to get the conversation started before he was no longer around to have it. That is the claim. Let me be upfront with you. I cannot verify the photos. Nobody outside a very small circle currently can. What I can do is walk through what was said, what the images appear to show, what the skeptical community has already pushed back on, and what the broader history of lunar anomaly photography tells us about how to think about a story like this one. The astronaut in question, who has asked that his name be used carefully because of ongoing discussions with the agency, served on a lunar orbit, or lunar surface mission during the late phase of the Apollo program. I am being deliberately vague because the specific mission assignment becomes important later, and because the public claims have been attributed differently in different sources. What is not in dispute is that the photographs he released are stamped with Kodak film metadata consistent with the era, printed on paper stock consistent with NASA archival practice, and accompanied by handwritten notes in a style that matches other documented samples of the astronaut's writing. That does not mean the photos are authentic lunar imagery. It means they are, at minimum, plausibly sourced. The images themselves are striking. One shows a portion of the lunar surface with what appears to be a long, narrow rectangular feature running along a slope near the rim of a medium-sized crater. The feature casts a sharp shadow. Its edges, as best you can see in a scanned print, are uncharacteristically straight. Another image, reportedly taken with a different camera, shows a cluster of smaller features arranged in what looks like a loosely geometric pattern. A third image, probably the most talked about, shows a dome-shaped object on the horizon, silhouetted against the lunar sky. The astronaut claims all three were photographed during the same orbital pass. The dome image is the one that tends to provoke the strongest reactions, because dome-shaped features are not unprecedented in lunar literature. Amateur astronomers in the 19th and 20th centuries reported dome-like structures clustered in certain regions, particularly around the Marius Hills and parts of the lunar highlands. Most of those reports were eventually attributed to volcanic swelling or to specific lighting conditions. But the astronaut's dome image appears, at least to several photo analysts who have looked at it, to have a shadow profile that does not easily map onto a gently sloping volcanic feature. The shadow suggests something more vertical, more distinctly elevated. It is one of those observations that is either a useful clue or an artifact of low print resolution, and without access to the original negative, it is genuinely hard to say which. If you spend any amount of time reading lunar anomaly literature, you will recognize that none of these features are entirely new to the discussion. Lunar domes have been catalogued by astronomers for more than a century, and most of them are understood to be volcanic in origin, produced by slow eruptions that happened when the moon was geologically active, billions of years ago. Straight-edged features have been reported since the early probe era, and most of them turn out on closer inspection to be artifacts of low-angle sunlight acting on real but irregular terrain. The eye wants geometry. Give it a sharp shadow and a clean edge, and it will build a rectangle where there isn't one. This is the most important skeptical point, and it deserves its own moment. Human vision is exquisitely tuned to find patterns, especially artificial ones. On the lunar surface, where sunlight hits at grazing angles and shadows run long, natural features can look unnaturally regular. Several of the most famous alleged structures in lunar imagery, including the so-called Blair cuspids and the Shard, have been re-examined with higher-resolution modern data and turned out to be perfectly ordinary outcrops. exaggerated by the lighting conditions at the moment of capture. Any photograph from the Apollo era, no matter how striking, has to be tested against this baseline. The released photos have not yet been tested against that baseline, because the higher resolution modern imagery of the specific locations they depict has not been publicly identified. The astronaut has indicated in interviews that he knows roughly where the photos were taken, but that he will not disclose exact coordinates until a framework for independent analysis is agreed on. This is either responsible or frustrating, depending on how you look at it. Frustrating, because without coordinates we cannot compare to Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter imagery. Responsible, because once the coordinates are out, the resulting debate will happen in public, and he will lose any control over how the analysis proceeds. The podcast interview went into some detail about his reasons for going public now. He said he had been advised during his active career that certain images from his mission would be subject to extended review and that the relevant prints should be returned to the agency after debrief. He said he complied with that procedure. He also said that he had retained personal copies of what he described as non-sensitive imagery for his own records, and that over the years he had come to believe that the images he kept showed things the public record did not acknowledge. He was careful not to accuse anyone of a cover-up in the traditional sense. He framed it, instead, as a set of judgment calls made decades ago under operational circumstances that no longer apply. That framing matters. There is a big difference between a suppressed discovery and a discovery that was simply not prioritized for release. Large agencies sit on enormous quantities of data, not because they are hiding it, but because the bandwidth to curate, contextualize, and publish all of it simply does not exist. Much of what we know about the Apollo record today comes from amateur researchers digitizing old archives and finding interesting things. No one bothered to look at closely in the original review. If unusual lunar features are in the archive, they may well have been cataloged at the time as uncertain or requiring further analysis, and then quietly set aside as higher priorities moved on. The more dramatic interpretation, which the astronaut has hinted at but not fully endorsed, is that some of the anomalies in the imagery represent features that are not natural in origin. He has used, carefully, the word structures. He has not used the word alien. He has not speculated about who built what or when or for what purpose. He has said, in effect, here is what I saw. Here is what I photographed. And I think the public is entitled to look at these images and decide for themselves what to make of them. A decision that careful is, in its own way, a claim. It is saying, at minimum, that the images are not explainable by ordinary natural processes to the astronaut's own satisfaction. It is saying that someone who has spent a significant portion of his life thinking about lunar geology does not find the conventional explanation sufficient. That is not the same as proof. It is a trained observer's personal assessment, and it is worth something. But it is not enough to settle a question that, if answered in the affirmative, would be the most important story in the history of planetary science. Let's talk about what the conventional science says. The Moon is, as best we can tell, a geologically dead body with a cratered surface, a thin exosphere, and no known indigenous life. It has no plate tectonics, no active volcanism, and no liquid water at the surface. It has been bombarded by meteors for more than 4 billion years. Its surface has been extensively mapped, photographed, and sampled. Nothing in the returned Apollo samples suggests biological activity. Nothing in the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter dataset suggests artificial construction. Most professional selenologists, the moon-specific branch of planetary science, consider the case for lunar anomalies to be, at best, very weak. Dr. Ananya Shah, a planetary geologist who has worked with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter data, has argued in recent commentary that the vast majority of alleged lunar structures, when cross-referenced against modern high-resolution imagery, resolve into natural features. Her point is not that every anomaly has been explained, but that the track record of anomaly claims is overwhelmingly toward eventual natural resolution. She recommends treating new photographic claims with the expectation that they will follow that pattern, and being pleasantly surprised if any of them do not. Her critique is sensible. It is also not quite a refutation, because the specific images the astronaut has released have not yet been run through that resolution process. Until they are, we are in a provisional zone, where the evidence is interesting enough to examine, but not established enough to incorporate into our working model. There are a few details, though, that make this particular case more interesting than the average lunar anomaly story. The first is the provenance. Independent researchers have verified that the film stock, paper stock, and handwriting are consistent with an authentic Apollo-era source. That does not prove the photos are what they claim to be, but it does rule out a large category of contemporary hoaxes. The second is the internal consistency of the shadows. Photogrammetrists who have looked at the images have noted that the shadow angles and lengths are mutually consistent in a way that would be difficult to fake without access to accurate lunar ephemeris data for a specific date. The third is the astronaut's credibility. He is a public figure with a long career and no history of fringe advocacy. When he speaks, even carefully, people listen. A fourth detail, less discussed, involves the metadata around the prints. The film rolls used during Apollo missions were cataloged with a system of identifying numbers, each of which mapped to a specific camera, a specific astronaut, and a specific mission phase. The prints released by the astronaut carry handwritten annotations that reportedly match the format used for his own mission's photographic log. That is something a knowledgeable hoaxer could potentially fake, but it is another layer of internal consistency that any serious analysis would need to account for. The fifth detail is probably the most interesting one. Several of the features visible in the photographs appear to cast shadows whose orientations are consistent with the sun angle that would have been present at the specific date and time of the astronaut's orbital pass. That is the kind of detail that is extremely difficult to reverse engineer unless you start with genuine mission data. It does not prove the images show real structures, but it does suggest that the photographs were taken when and where they are claimed to have been taken. If the images turn out to be misinterpreted natural features, the story ends quickly. He will, I suspect, accept that outcome with grace. If the images turn out to show something harder to explain, the story will not end quickly, because the follow-on questions, what, how old, who, will not be answerable on the timescale of a single news cycle. The range of plausible explanations, if we did somehow end up confirming that the photographs show engineered features, is broader than most people assume. It would not necessarily mean, for example, that extraterrestrial visitors built something on the moon. It could mean that earlier human space programs, either during the Cold War or before, placed hardware on the lunar surface that was never publicly documented. It could mean that certain geologic processes we do not yet understand produce features that mimic engineering. It could mean, in the most conservative version, that the images capture the debris field of a test vehicle or a crashed probe that nobody has so far bothered to list. Only after all those explanations have been examined and set aside should the more exotic interpretations even enter the conversation, and even then, carefully, with appropriate epistemic humility. On a technical level, this case will be resolved, one way or another, by direct comparison with existing and future lunar imagery. On a historical level, it is part of a longer pattern of astronaut disclosures that have accumulated quietly over the last 3 decades. Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon during Apollo 14, spent the latter part of his life advocating for greater transparency around anomalous aerial phenomena. Gordon Cooper made similar statements. Other astronauts have stayed quiet, but their families have indicated that conversations happened privately that never made it to the record. On a broader level, the story is about how much we are willing to reconsider our assumptions when trained observers ask us to look again at material we thought we had already understood. It is worth dwelling briefly on the physical realities of lunar photography during the Apollo era, because this is the kind of context that helps us weigh the new claim properly. The cameras carried by the astronauts were custom-modified Hasselblad units, designed to operate in vacuum and extreme temperature swings. The film was Kodak Ektachrome or its variants, carefully prepared to handle the unusual radiation environment. The astronauts were trained to document specific features on specific schedules, and the exposure settings were worked out in advance by mission planners. This means that any photograph taken during a mission is, in a sense, an intentional photograph. The astronaut pointed the camera at something for a reason. If the released images really do show anomalous structures, it is not because the cameras caught them by accident. It is because someone decided, in the moment, that they were worth documenting. That is a detail that often gets missed in discussions of lunar anomaly photography. The Apollo astronauts were not tourists. They were trained observers operating under very constrained conditions. Their frames of reference and their decisions about where to point the camera matter. If an experienced astronaut, working within a disciplined mission protocol, chose to take a picture of something and then later chose to hold on to a personal copy of that picture for the rest of his life, that is not the same as a blurry image pulled off a late-night satellite feed. It is data, filtered through a person whose training was specifically designed to make his observations reliable. Of course, training does not make anyone immune to lighting illusions or pattern bias. It just means that the observer in question brought a higher-than-average level of scrutiny to what he was seeing. He would have known what a natural lunar feature was supposed to look like. He would have recognized, as well as anyone, the way grazing sunlight exaggerates terrain. If he decided, after all that what he was looking at warranted a photograph, that decision carries weight. Not proof. Weight. What stays with me, after sitting with this for a while, is how small the dividing line is between a photograph that changes our picture of the moon and a photograph that does not. A few shadow angles, a few cross-referenced coordinates, a few months of independent analysis. We are, plausibly, a small amount of work away from either confirming that the images are natural features misread under unusual lighting, or from opening up a conversation that planetary science has so far been able to avoid having. For now, the photographs are circulating. The astronaut has indicated he will cooperate with a serious independent analysis, but has not yet endorsed any specific team to conduct it. The agency has declined to comment publicly, which should not, by itself, be read as anything dramatic. Agencies decline to comment on a lot of things. The community of lunar researchers is divided, with most expressing polite skepticism and a minority saying, quietly, that the photos deserve the benefit of the doubt until the analysis is done. If you had asked me 2 years ago whether I expected a story like this to surface, I would have said probably not, but also probably eventually. The Apollo archive is too large, the anomaly spotting community is too active, and the older astronauts are, unfortunately, running out of time. The only surprise, really, is that there have not been more releases like this one. There may be more yet. There is one more layer I want to add, because it keeps rattling around in my head. Some of the most interesting lunar anomaly claims from earlier decades have concerned the far side of the moon, the hemisphere we never see from Earth. The Soviet probe Luna 3 produced the first images of the fair side in 1959, and ever since then, researchers have noted that the far side looks markedly different from the near side. It has fewer of the dark volcanic plains, called Maria, that dominate our view. It has a thicker crust. It has a cratering pattern that, depending on who you ask, either makes perfect sense under standard models of lunar history or shows features that standard models struggle to explain. The astronaut who released the new photographs has not said anything about the far side. But his willingness to reopen a broader conversation about lunar anomalies has already drawn renewed attention to that older debate, and to the long list of oddities that have accumulated around our nearest neighbor. What do you make of the images? based on what you have seen? Do you lean toward the conventional reading, the lighting and terrain explanation that has absorbed so many previous anomaly claims? Or do you think this one is different, for reasons worth taking seriously? I am genuinely curious. I will keep watching the story, and when the independent analysis produces a real answer, we will sit down and go through it properly. Until then, keep your skepticism sharp, but keep your curiosity sharper. The moon has been up there for 4.5 billion years. It can afford to wait for us to ask better questions.